Imagine standing in your own kitchen feeling like a ghost while your parents celebrate a sister who hasn't even tried half as hard as you have. And you realize that no matter how much you bleed or how much you achieve, you will always be the second choice, the shadow, and the disappointment that they never wanted to acknowledge. But what happens when the child they pushed aside becomes the only one they eventually need to survive? Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about pain, it is a story about the ultimate cold-blooded success that forced a family to choke on their own regret. And by the end of this, you will know exactly why the best revenge isn't a shout or an argument, but a life lived so well that they can't even afford to look you in the eye. The silence in our house was never peaceful. It was heavy and suffocating, like a thick layer of dust that only settled on my shoulders while my sister Maya lived in a world of golden light and constant praise. I remember sitting at the dinner table when I was 10 years old, clutching a report card with straight A grades, waiting for my father to look up from his plate and just once tell me I did a good job, but his eyes were fixed on Maya as she described a finger painting she had made that morning. And my mother was beaming as if she had just discovered a masterpiece of modern art. I held my paper out with trembling hands, and my father just pushed it aside to reach for the salt without even glancing at the ink or the effort I had poured into every single page for years. I thought if I worked harder or ran faster or spoke louder, I would finally break through the invisible wall they had built around me, but the wall only grew taller and thicker with every passing season until I realized I wasn't part of their family. I was just a ghost who lived in the spare room and ate the leftovers of their affection. While Maya got the best of everything, from the designer clothes I was never allowed to touch to the emotional support I was. Welcome back to Revenge Water Official. If you are enjoying the content and want to support the journey, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps Revenge Water Official grow and bring you even better videos every single day. So join the family today by clicking subscribe, and thank you for being part of the team. Starved of every single day, they would spend thousands on her hobbies while telling me we didn't have enough money for my basic school supplies, and I would watch from the hallway as they hugged her and told her she was their pride and joy, while I stood in the dark wondering what I had done wrong to deserve such a cold existence. The betrayal of a parent isn't a single event, it is a slow erosion of your soul where every ignored achievement feels like a strike against your worth, and every bit of favoritism shown to a sibling feels like a dagger in your back. I spent my teenage years hiding in the library or staying late at school just to avoid the crushing weight of being invisible in my own home, because seeing them be a happy family of 3 was more painful than being alone. I started working 3 part-time jobs when I was 16 just to save enough money to escape the house that felt like a prison, and I never told them how much I was struggling or how exhausted I was, because I knew they wouldn't care. They were too busy planning Maya's future and talking about which prestigious college she would grace with her presence, while they hadn't even asked me what I wanted to do after graduation. I remember the night I finally broke inside when I came home with a scholarship offer that covered my entire tuition, and I walked into the living room thinking this would be the moment they finally saw me, but my mother didn't even look up from the magazine she was reading, and my father just told me to be quiet because Maya was taking a nap, and they didn't want the noise to wake her up. I stood there with the letter in my hand, feeling the hot sting of tears that I refused to let fall. An anchor moment, something shifted inside me. The love I had been trying to win turned into a cold, hard stone of resolve, and I realized that I didn't need their validation to be someone important. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, then I would become the most successful stranger they had ever met. And I would leave them so far behind that they would have to crane their necks just to see my shadow. I packed my bags that night while they were sleeping, and I didn't leave a note or a goodbye, because you don't owe an explanation to people who never listened to you in the first place. I stepped out into the cold night air and felt a sense of freedom that was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and as I walked toward the bus station, I made a silent vow to myself that I would never be hungry for their love again, and I would build a kingdom that they would never be invited to enter. The injustice of my childhood became the fuel for my ambition, and every time I felt like giving up in the years that followed, I would remember the way my father pushed my report card aside, and the way my mother looked through me as if I didn't exist, and that memory would push me to work harder and climb higher until I was untouchable. I moved to a city where nobody knew my name, and I started from the absolute bottom, sleeping on a floor and eating noodles while I poured every ounce of my energy into my education and my career. And I learned that the world is a cruel place, but it is much kinder than a family that doesn't want you. I stopped answering their rare phone calls, which only ever happened when they needed something or wanted to brag about Maya's latest failure that they were spinning into a success, and I blocked their numbers when they started asking for money I didn't have yet, because I knew that if I gave them an inch they would take everything I had built. I was no longer the little girl begging for a scrap of attention. I was a woman on a mission to prove that the stone the builders rejected would become the cornerstone of something magnificent, and as I walked into my first real office building, I felt the weight of my past starting to lift, replaced by the heavy responsibility of my future success which was coming for me, whether my parents were ready for it or not. The second chapter of my life began in a cramped studio apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors breathing and the radiator hissed like a dying animal, but to me it was a palace because it was mine and it didn't contain the suffocating judgment of my parents. I spent the next 4 years working like a woman possessed, balancing a full course load with a grueling corporate internship that drained my physical strength but sharpened my mind into a blade. I watched from afar through social media as my parents threw a lavish graduation party for Maya, even though she had barely scraped by with a passing degree, and they posted photos of themselves beaming with pride while I spent my own graduation day sitting in a coffee shop finishing a project that would eventually land me my first six-figure salary. The contrast was a constant ache in my chest, but I used that pain as a compass to guide me away from the life they expected me to have. I climbed the corporate ladder with a ferocity that terrified my peers because I wasn't just working for a paycheck, I was working for the right to never have to look back at the people who made me feel worthless. I remember the day I landed my first major promotion to senior vice president at a top tech firm in the city, and for a split second I felt the old urge to call my mother and tell her the news just to hear her voice sound surprised for once, but I looked at my phone and realized I didn't even have her number saved anymore, and the urge vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold satisfaction. I was becoming a ghost to them just as they had been ghosts to me during my darkest hours, and I started investing every penny I earned into real estate and stocks, building a portfolio that grew faster than I ever imagined possible, while my sister Maya was busy spending my parents' retirement fund on failed business ventures and luxury vacations she couldn't afford. I heard through the grapevine of distant relatives that things were starting to crumble at home because my father's health was failing and Maya had no intention of working a real job to support them. And for the first time in my life I felt a sense of power that had nothing to do with money. It was the power of knowing that the tables were turning and the daughter they neglected was the only one with the resources to save them. I moved into a penthouse overlooking the skyline and bought a car that cost more than the house I grew up in, and I started wearing my success like armor so that no one could ever see the scared little girl I used to be. I remember standing in front of a mirror before a high-stakes board meeting and realizing that my face had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by a sharp determination and eyes that had seen too much betrayal to ever be naive again. The injustice of my childhood had forged me into a titan, and I was ready to face whatever storms were coming my way because I knew I could survive anything they threw at me. I started receiving emails from my mother under a new address, and they were filled with fake sweetness and forced memories of a childhood that never happened. She wrote about how much they missed me, and how they always knew I would be the successful one in the family, but I could see through the lies like they were made of glass. They didn't miss me, they missed the bank account they assumed I now had, and they were desperate because Maya had finally run their finances into the ground. I deleted every single message without replying because silence is the most expensive thing you can give to people who didn't value your words when you were begging to be heard. I felt a grim sense of irony, watching them try to crawl back into a life they had kicked me out of, and I realized that revenge isn't about hurting people, it is about letting them experience the world without you, and watching them realize they are nothing without the person they discarded. I was no longer interested in their apologies or their explanations because 1,000 apologies couldn't fix the hole they left in my heart when I was a child, but $1 million in my bank account could certainly build a fence high enough to keep them out of my new life. I began to travel the world for business and pleasure, staying in 5-star hotels and eating at restaurants where the menu didn't have prices, and every time I looked at a beautiful view I thought about how my parents told me I would never amount to anything beyond a secretary or a housewife. The fire in my gut never went out, it only grew hotter with every milestone I reached, and I started planning my next move, which would be the ultimate demonstration of my independence. I bought a massive estate on the coast and filled it with art and books and everything I was ever denied, and I invited everyone I knew to a housewarming party except for my own blood relatives because they didn't deserve to breathe the air of the kingdom I had built from their ashes. I was finally the main character of my own story, and the supporting cast that had tried to ruin the script was left outside in the rain wondering where it all went wrong. The betrayal of my sister was the hardest part to swallow because she knew what they were doing to me, and she enjoyed the favoritism like it was a drug. She would smirk at me when she got the bigger piece of cake or the newer toy, and she never once stood up for me when I was being scolded for her mistakes. So seeing her struggle now was a form of poetic justice that I savored with every breath I took. I was the one who survived the storm, and she was the one drowning in a puddle of her own entitlement, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they all came knocking on my door with their hands out expecting a miracle from the ghost they tried to bury. But they forgot one thing about ghosts: they have nothing to lose and they never forget how they died. The day finally came when the shadow of my past collided with the brilliant light of my present, and it happened in the most public way possible during a high-profile charity gala where I was the guest of honor for my contributions to local education initiatives. I was standing in a room filled with crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive perfume when I saw three figures standing near the entrance looking like relics from a life I had long since buried. My parents looked older and smaller. Then I remembered, and Maya looked haggard, her eyes darting around the room with a mixture of envy and desperation that made my stomach turn. They had clearly tracked me down using the press releases, and they stood there in their out-of-date clothes looking like intruders in the world I had built with my own sweat and blood. As I approached them, the crowd parted like the Red Sea because everyone knew who I was, but nobody knew who they were to me. My mother reached out a hand that was shaking, and she tried to put on that motherly smile that used to work on me when I was 5, but now it just looked like a mask of deception falling apart at the seams. She called my name with a voice that cracked, and my father tried to stand tall, but his shoulders were slumped under the weight of his own failures, and Maya just stared at my diamond necklace with a hunger that was almost nauseating. They started talking all at once, telling me how proud they were and how they had been searching for me for years. Which was a blatant lie because I had never changed my name and my office was in the tallest building in the city. They spoke about how the family needed to stay together and how blood was thicker than water, while I stood there in my tailored silk gown feeling absolutely nothing but a cold clinical curiosity. I let them talk for 5 minutes without saying a single word, just watching their mouths move as they spun a narrative where they were the loving parents and I was the wayward daughter who had finally come home. And when they finally ran out of breath, I looked my father in the eye and asked him if he remembered the night of my high school graduation when he took Maya out for steak and left me at home to eat a bowl of cereal alone. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in that ballroom, and his face turned a shade of pale that I will never forget. I told them right there in front of the elite of the city that I didn't have a family and that the people standing in front of me were nothing more than strangers who shared a bit of my DNA but none of my soul. Maya tried to scream that I was being heartless and that I owed them for raising me, but I laughed a sound that was as sharp as broken glass, and I reminded her that they didn't raise me, they survived me while they poured everything into her, and now that she had wasted it all, they were looking for a new host to bleed dry. I told my mother that the daughter she ignored had died a long time ago in that quiet kitchen, and the woman standing here was a self-made empire that they couldn't afford to be a part of. I called security over with a simple tilt of my head and watched as the people who once made me feel like nothing were escorted out of the building in front of everyone. They were crying and shouting about injustice, but the only injustice I saw was the decades of silence they had handed me when I was a child. Begging for a crumb of their time, I went back to my seat and finished my speech with a steady hand and a clear voice because their presence didn't rattle me anymore. It only confirmed that I had won the game they didn't even know they were playing. The next day, my legal team served them with a formal no trespass order and a clear warning that any attempt to contact me or my company would result in a lawsuit that would strip them of the very little they had left. I wasn't doing it to be cruel, I was doing it to protect the peace I had spent 10 years building in the vacuum of their absence. But the story didn't end there, because a week later I received a call from a hospital stating that my father had suffered a stroke and my mother was hysterical because they couldn't afford the specialized care he needed. The old version of me would have dropped everything and ran to their side, hoping that this tragedy would finally earn me the love I wanted. But the woman I had become stayed in her office and looked at the city skyline. I realized that their emergency was not my responsibility, and that for years they had ignored my emotional and mental strokes without a second thought. I sent a check that covered the basic medical expenses because I am not a monster, but I made it clear through my lawyer that this was a one-time settlement and a final severance of our ties. The money was a drop in the ocean for me, but for them it was a reminder that they were now living on the charity of the child they had discarded like trash. I watched the sunset from my balcony that evening, feeling a strange sense of completion, because the revenge wasn't in the money or the fame, but in the fact that I no longer needed them to feel whole. I was the architect of my own joy and the master of my own fate, while they were trapped in a cycle of regret and poverty of their own making. Maya sent me a long rambling text message blaming me for everything from their financial ruin to her own failed marriage, but I didn't even read the whole thing before hitting delete, because her opinions held no more weight than the wind rattling the windows. I had reached a level of success where their voices were just background noise in a life that was far too loud and vibrant to be dimmed by their smallness, I started a foundation to help children who were being raised in homes with favoritism and neglect, giving them the resources and the hope I never had, and every time I saw one of those kids succeed, I felt a piece of my own childhood being healed, and I realized that the best way to spite my parents was to be the kind of person they could never understand, a person who uses their pain to build a bridge for others instead of a wall for themselves. I was no longer defined by the betrayal but by the way I rose above it, and as I looked at the empire I had created, I knew that the little girl in the kitchen would finally be proud of the woman she had become, and she wouldn't need a single word of praise from the people who failed her to know that she was finally enough. The months that followed were a masterclass in the psychological warfare of regret, because my family realized that I was truly unreachable, and the desperation that set in for them was a sight to behold. As I watched from the safety of my high-rise office, I began to receive letters not just from my mother but from aunts and uncles I hadn't seen in 20 years, all of them suddenly remembering my birthday and my favorite colors, and how they always knew I was a special child. But I knew the truth, that they were all circling like vultures around a carcass, hoping for a piece of the wealth I had accumulated. And it only made my resolve harder than a diamond. My sister Maya, who had spent her entire life being the center of the universe, was now forced to take a job as a low-level clerk just to keep the lights on in their crumbling house, and the irony was not lost on me that she was now living the life of drudgery she always assumed was my destiny. I decided to take a trip back to my hometown, not to visit them but to buy the very land where our old house stood, because the bank was foreclosing on it, and I wanted to be the one to sign the papers. I pulled up to the driveway in a black SUV that cost more than their entire neighborhood, and I stepped out onto the gravel, feeling the ghosts of my past screaming under my designer heels. My mother came to the door, her eyes wide with a flicker of hope that I was there to save them, but I didn't even walk toward the porch. I stood by the mailbox and looked at the overgrown lawn and the peeling paint of the house that had once been my prison, and I felt a profound sense of nothingness. She started to cry and told me they had nowhere to go, and that my father was still recovering, and that surely I couldn't be so heartless as to let my own flesh and blood sleep on the street. But I looked her dead in the eye and told her that blood is just a biological coincidence, and that they had let me sleep in a room full of emotional coldness for 18 years, so a few nights in a shelter might finally give them the perspective they lacked. I informed her that I had bought the property, and that they had exactly 48 hours to vacate before I sent in the demolition crew to tear the house down and turn it into a community park for children who actually deserved a place to play. She screamed that I was a monster and that she wished she had never given birth to me, and I just smiled, because that was the most honest thing she had ever said to me in my entire life. It was the final confirmation that I had never been loved for who I was, only for the role I was supposed to play in their drama. I watched them pack their meager belongings into an old beat-up car that Maya had borrowed, and as they drove away I felt the final thread of my connection to them snap like a dry twig in a storm. There was no joy in seeing them suffer, but there was an incredible amount of peace in seeing them leave my life for good, because I realized that as long as that house stood, a part of me was still trapped in that kitchen waiting for a father who would never look up. I stood on the empty lot the next day and watched the wrecking ball swing through the walls of the master bedroom and the living room, where I was always the invisible observer, and with every brick that fell a weight lifted off my chest that I didn't even know I was still carrying. I was no longer the girl who was ignored. I was the woman who had demolished the very foundation of her own trauma and built something beautiful in its place. My business continued to skyrocket because I was no longer distracted by the lingering hope of a reconciliation, and I started a global mentorship program for young women who were being held back by family expectations and toxic environments. I became a household name not just for my money, but for my unyielding stance on self-worth and boundaries, and I was invited to speak at the commencement ceremony of the very university that had given me a scholarship all those years ago. I stood on that stage looking out at thousands of faces, and I told them that your family of origin is just a starting point, and it does not have to be your destination. I told them that the people who share your blood are not entitled to your future if they didn't respect your past, and I felt the power of my words echoing in the silent auditorium, because I was the living proof that success is the loudest way to tell your enemies that they failed to break you. Maya tried to sue me for a portion of my earnings, claiming that her mental health had suffered because of my public rejection of the family, but my legal team laughed her out of the courtroom, and I countersued for harassment, which effectively silenced her. For the next 5 years she was finally experiencing the consequences of a world that didn't revolve around her whims, and my parents were living in a small apartment I had anonymously funded through a third party because I wanted them to be safe, but I never wanted them to know it came from me. I wanted them to live the rest of their lives wondering if I cared. or if I had forgotten them entirely because that uncertainty was the exact same poison they had fed me for 2 decades. I was moving on to bigger and better things, launching a new venture in renewable energy and traveling to parts of the world they couldn't even find on a map. And every time I achieved a new goal, I would take a moment to breathe in the fresh air of my freedom and realize that the injustice of my childhood was the greatest gift I ever received, because it forced me to become a warrior in a world of sheep, and I was now the alpha of my own life, leading a pack of people who valued me for my mind and my heart rather than my utility. I was finally whole, and the story of the ignored daughter was over, replaced by the legend of the woman who changed everything. The final chapter of my journey didn't end with a grand explosion or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet realization that I had finally outgrown the need for the people who once occupied every corner of my mind. I was sitting in my glass office high above the city, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and violet, when a package arrived at my desk. It was an old leather-bound photo album that had somehow survived the demolition of our childhood home, and as I flipped through the pages, I saw the history of a family that never truly existed except in the eyes of my parents. There were dozens of photos of Maya at her birthdays, her recitals, and her graduations, but I was only in the background of a few shots, a blurry figure at the edge of the frame or a reflection in a window, and for the first time I didn't feel the sharp sting of pain. I felt a profound sense of pity for the people who had looked at a child like me and seen nothing of value. I realized that their inability to see me was never my failure, it was their limitation, and by trying to earn their love, I had been asking blind people to describe the color of my soul. I closed the book and placed it in the trash bin because I didn't need a paper trail of a life that was designed to make me feel small. My success had reached a level where I was no longer just wealthy, I was influential, and I used that influence to change the laws regarding inheritance and family rights in my state, ensuring that no other child would be forced to support parents who had abandoned them emotionally or physically. I became a beacon for those who were told they were nothing, and my story was translated into a dozen languages, inspiring millions of people to walk away from the tables where love was no longer being served. I heard through a final report from my private investigators that Maya had finally taken a job as a social worker, ironically helping families navigate the very trauma she had helped create, and my mother had spent her final days talking to anyone who would listen about her famous daughter who was changing the world. She died still trying to claim a piece of my glory, but I didn't attend the funeral because I had already grieved for her 20 years ago in that kitchen, and I didn't want my presence to become a circus for the media. I sent a simple wreath of white lilies with no name attached because the silence I had mastered was my ultimate signature. My father remained in the assisted living facility I paid for, and I visited him just once before he passed away, not to argue or to seek an apology, but to let him see the woman I had become. He looked at me with eyes that were clouded by age and regret, and he tried to say my name, but I just placed a hand on his shoulder and told him it was okay because I had forgiven him, not for his sake but for mine, so that I wouldn't have to carry his ghost into my future. I walked out of that facility and felt a lightness in my step that I had never known because the final debt had been paid and the account was officially closed. I spent the next decade building a legacy that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with purpose. I founded schools and hospitals, and I mentored a generation of leaders who knew that their worth was not defined by their parents' mistakes or their siblings' successes. I found a partner who saw me for exactly who I was, and together we built a home filled with the laughter and the validation I was denied as a child. And when my own children were born, I looked into their eyes and made a promise that they would never have to work for my attention or bleed for my love, because I knew exactly how much it cost to survive a childhood without it. The story of the ignored daughter who became a queen was complete, and as I stood on the balcony of my estate looking out at the world I had conquered, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the penthouse or the millions or the fame. It was the fact that I was happy and that my happiness was entirely my own creation, with no input or permission from the people who tried to break me. I had turned my tears into a river that carried me to a new continent of possibility, and I had turned the stones they threw at me into the foundation of a palace that would stand long after their names were forgotten. I was no longer the girl seeking water from a dry well. I was the ocean, and I was finally at peace with the tide because I knew that no matter how much the world tried to ignore me, I had made it impossible for them to ever look away, and that was the only victory I ever truly needed to win.